Good afternoon. This is episode 2, and I'm just learning how to do all of these things. So I told them when I was in high school, when computers came out, the only one we had at school, you didn't admit to using it because the only one we had was in the remedial lab, and nobody was copping to go into there. So I'm not very good at this stuff. I'm having to learn. And then I told them when I was in high school, computers were the size of a washing machine. So today's episode is I want to talk about my first time as a caregiver and how all of that led up to it. So the title of this episode is going to be called How I Became the Newly Crowned King of Deflection. And I'm going to talk about my dad's disease. Okay, so I think it was about 2007, Dad had shoulder surgery for a torn rotator cuff. He went through the surgery well, did the therapy. Everything went well till after the therapy was finished. Then he started noticing that he was losing the strength in his other arm. And soon after that, he began losing strength in the arm he had just had surgery on. So his doctors sent us to Duke University, and so I can remember that day very well. After I got into grief therapy, I can remember my grief therapist asking me, "Do you remember the last time you were happy?" And I said, "I can tell you the exact moment." We had gone to Duke that day. They had took an enormous amount of blood from Dad that day. I felt really sorry for him. They let us take lunch, so we got sandwiches, and it was my mom, my dad, my Aunt Mary, Donna, my sister Sandra, my sister, and myself. We went out on this huge balcony and ate our sandwiches, and it was a beautiful day, and we just laughed and had fun and just together as a family, which we've always done. We traveled together for so many years that we've always been really close. So when we came back from lunch, they took us in a conference room, and we all sat around in a large oval table as two specialists began to talk about Dad's test results. I became the king of deflection that day. They told Dad that he had ALS, and that stands for amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. A lot of people know it as also Lou Gehrig's disease. And so everyone was taking it pretty bad that day. And so to keep from falling apart, what I did was I sat there and wrote everything the doctor said out of his mouth. And that was the only thing that kept me together. It's a piece of paper I still have to this day. So after that was over, my dad made a statement that I'll never forget. I was raised in a really good Christian home by wonderful parents, and my dad told the doctors, said, "Well, if this is what God has for me, then I've had a good life, I have a good family, good friends, so I'm a winner either way, if I go or if I stay." And I'll never forget those words. But when we broke free from them, Dad had to have a couple more tests done. So we broke into two groups, and Sandra and I went across the hall with Dad to get the blood taken. And knowing me like my sister does, she knew I was about ready to burst. So I asked her if she had Dad. So I went back out on that balcony that we had been on a little over an hour before. Now, it wasn't so sunny. I was heartbroken. Our family had just received news that would change the dynamics forever. And I went out there to cry. Well, I couldn't cry. When I opened my mouth, the only thing that would come out was a scream. And I knew I couldn't do that. So I've always been real hard on myself, and I made a deal with myself. I said, if you're not going to cry, if you're not going to grieve, if you're not going to get it out now, then from this point on, you're not going to grieve. You're going to keep a stiff upper lip. You're going to be there for your family. You're going to be positive. You're not going to let your dad see you sweat. and you're going to keep his life as independent and as good as he can. And so that was the deal I made with myself. So all of those things that I had written, I basically dug a hole and buried all of these things, because the only thing that was important to me was being the perfect caretaker I could be to my dad, because he'd always done so much for me. And so that started our journey in 2007 of my dad's illness. And there wasn't any books like those dummies for ALS for dummies or anything like that. So a lot of the stuff we did by trial and error. And trust me, if we did it wrong, my dad really let us know. So that was the beginning of that. I'm not going to talk about everything in long terms, but these first two things were the catalyst that led to the years of depression. Okay, a month after Dad had gotten his diagnosis, my best friend, who was 63, she had been my boss for 15 years. She and I were the best of friends. She called me a month to the day after my dad had learned he had ALS, and I knew she hadn't been feeling good. So she told me she had been diagnosed with liver cancer. So for the next 3 years, we partied all the time with my dad. We didn't need an excuse. We had Super Bowl parties and everything. And we've always done stuff like that anyway. We've always been close. We've always said, I love you. And so that wasn't really nothing new for us. But we knew there's a difference when you know you are coming to the end of your family and just living everyday lives. We were actually even closer and being a family like a lot of people would be. And so we just started in and did all of Dad's care. My sister Sandra, my mom, my nephew Caleb, and myself dealt with Dad, and we would work in 2 shifts. Ultimately, both his legs stopped working, so all of his limbs were just dead weight, and he depended on us for everything. So in the meantime of taking care of Dad, I would always keep in touch with my best friend, and every time I would ask her when her liver transplant was, because I was going to go to Charleston with her when she had it done, she would tell me her numbers were still too good to get a new liver. So here I am. My dad just found out he has a terminal illness, and unless she got a transplant, a month later I found out that my best friend Clara had also a life-threatening illness. And we learned a lot while Dad was sick, how to treat him, how to feed him. Everything, like I said, was trial and error. There was a couple of times he came off the ramp of his van in his wheelchair and thought he was on the Dukes of Hazzard, and I had to push the wheelchair to keep it from going over the side. But then let's go to 2011. 2011 in February, my dad had to be put in the hospital because his gallbladder was going bad. And if we would have had the surgery to remove it, we would have probably had to take him off the breathing machine because those breathing muscles were weak. And so they gave him morphine. We took him back home. So about a month to the day later, he had the same thing happen again, took him to the hospital. So I'm thinking, they will give him morphine, we'll take him back home. And my sisters had been staying with him, so that night I had taken my mom back home to do all the business and stuff we needed at home. And after being there about 10 minutes, my sisters called and were like, "Get back up here now." So we were 5 minutes away from the hospital. My older sister called and put my mom on speakerphone because my dad was a do not resuscitate, and she was trying to get mom to talk to dad over the phone and tell him to breathe because he wasn't breathing. And every time they would say breathe, he would shake his head no, and he was looking up at the ceiling, hadn't then put his glasses on because it was like he was seeing something. And so while she's on the phone with mom, he dies. And so I told him that was the worst 5 minutes of my life because my mom went stick straight in the seat. She threw her phone in the floor and she said, "Oh my, he's dead." So I tell people, here I am knowing my dad's dead, what I was coming into when I got to the hospital, and praying that God wouldn't let anything happen to my mom. And hey, I'm driving a car. So when I got there that night to the hospital, again, I became the king of deflection. I wanted to make sure nobody got their feelings hurt. Everybody got to spend time, with his body in his room, and all of that. So through the funeral, I decided to not grieve like I needed to because I said I'll be strong for my family, and once I know they're okay, then I'll do my own grieving. Okay, so about a month and a day after my dad died, Clara had wanted to come to his funeral, but I knew she was too weak. I told her I didn't want her to do anything that would hurt her own health. And so Dad died. Well, it had been 3 weeks because we went into probate, and I hadn't heard from her, and I knew that was odd. And so I started calling every number that I had for her that day. And about an hour later, her husband called me back and said she's in the Greenville hospital and she doesn't have long. And so I felt like someone had kicked me in the gut because she'd been telling me that her numbers were still too good to get the transplant. And maybe to me it was wishful thinking, but he told me very early on she decided not to get the transplant, but she didn't have the heart to tell me that not only was I going to lose my dad, but I was also going to lose my best friend too. And so she died a month and a day after my dad died. We sang in both funerals. By the time her funeral got there, the numbness of my dad dying had worn off. And so when I got to her funeral that day, we got to sing in a back room, and I knew I couldn't do it on stage. I took a full nerve pill. When her son began her eulogy, I started cracking, my armor did. So I stood outside the door of the funeral home until it was time for us to come in and sing. And after her funeral was over, that's when I broke down for the first time. And after that, I started having really bad panic attacks, really bad migraine headaches, and all of these things. So losing these two people, a parent and a best friend, a month apart, would have devastating effects on me. And I don't want anyone to go through what I did. I promised God if he would get me out of the depression that I would share my story with people because I never wanted anyone to feel by themselves. So the next episode, I'll talk about, again, how the king of deflection lived after this. And it wasn't over yet. Just a course of 2 years, finding out Dad was sick, taking care of him 3 years, and then there's a period of 2 years that is just horrible. Most people, I think they don't believe me when I tell them what our family went through. There was also, I had sicknesses in between because of not grieving. We had began to lose so many family members at such a concentrated time that I was diagnosed with complicated grief depression, and it's where you lose so many people at one time that there's never a way that you could grieve like you needed to for those people and ever feel like you had completed your grieving. So the next episode, I'll talk about how not grieving, not getting things out, not talking, you can either laugh or cry when you're in a situation, or you can withdraw. Withdrawing's not a good thing. So next time I'll tell you about how I withdrew and what else happened after that. It'll be faster this time, but this is the two that really packed the biggest punch to me, as those are my dad and best friend. So I hope everybody has a good Saturday, and always remember that you can't take care of anyone else, caregivers, unless you take care of yourself first. Everybody have a good weekend. Bye.